few years ago, a dear friend of mine, an atheist, asked me if certain passages in the Bible are contentious, are used as platforms to substantiate bigoted worldviews or even acts of violence, might Christians not treat the Bible then as a living document, open to revision, excision, the paring away of behavioral codes incompatible with contemporary life? It's a good question, and it arose from a brief, itself contentious exchange we had on Facebook about a post from atheist philosopher and scientist Sam Harris, in which Harris attempted to explain what atheism is and what it is not. My friend's question led me to the conclusion that his question cannot be addressed, let alone answered, without considering what Christianity is and what it is not, at least as I see it. That qualifying phrase, "as I see it," might be where a number of atheists get tripped up in considering or defining religion. Their philosophical position is, by nature, fixed, an absence of belief in a God, whereas the religion to which I belong is malleably defined at best. It resists being pinned down, which is, on one hand, a virtue, placing it less on a footing with the cold, glassy symmetries of mathematics than with the roiling, whispered sleights of poetry. And on the other hand, a pointed disadvantage, because as civilized people, we rightly privilege logic, answers, progress forward built on the scaffolding of certainties. So, then, in as concise a way as I know how to put it, Christianity is, to me, the life and example of Christ. And the life and example of Christ is an answer or utterance in response to the world that preceded it and that world's attendant codes and cruelties. The reason we should not strike contentious or discomforting passages from the Bible is because those passages represent what the world was prior to Christ, and, most importantly for us, what it will persist in being and becoming in lieu of Christ. The books of the Old Testament are, first and foremost, an embroidered history of a people, and we take and should take such histories with their blights intact, just as we would whitewash the Western historical record of recent centuries to our detriment. How much easier would it be to repeat the sins of the past, be it industrial genocide or the commerce of slavery, without insisting on and learning from their having transpired? We cannot strike passages condoning the stoning of people to death from the Bible, because to do so would rob the teaching of Christ in Matthew 5:38 and 39, and the example of Christ in John 8:1 through 11 of their revolutionary vision. We cannot strike the passages that seem to indict homosexuality, because to do so would discourage the discipline of close reading for meaning and the discipline of looking beyond the Bible itself for cultural context. The account in Genesis 19 of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah is not a judgment on homosexuality, but a judgment on rape. Countless people get this wrong, true, but without the text before them, those people will never have a chance to get it right. And what seemed to be Paul's judgments on homosexuality as we understand it in the 21st century are revealed to be not condemnations of consensual same-sex love and intimacy, but judgments on the sexual enslavement of adolescent and prepubescent boys when one takes the time to follow in the footsteps of scholars like Sarah Rudin, who've done the legwork of placing the passages in their historical and cultural contexts. We need the contentious passages to remind us of whom our ancestors were, and in some cases, to remind us who we must never again be. That some Christians don't understand this is unfortunate, but the believers who use religious texts as blunt instruments to persecute, shame, and abuse others are never going to have the epiphanies waiting for them on homosexuality, on capital punishment, etc., if atheists and thoughtful Christians continue to let those believers position themselves as the faces and voices of modern Christianity. I'd wager that most contemporary Pharisaical believers have met Christ, but still do not see or know Christ. And in failing to recognize Christ as the final, radical, liberating word on how human beings must conduct themselves, fail to see the church and their own lives as manifestations and extensions of His. And that is tragic. Because when we do recognize Christ, our lives, the communities we build, and the relationships we nurture become those very edits my friend was wondering why we as believers don't make to the actual biblical text itself. In short, Christians whose sense of their religion is rich with contextual awareness, intellectual rigor, and deep focus on Christ as the cornerstone of the whole enterprise, these Christians do indeed regard and present the Bible as a living, changing, growing document. It is not static. It is not calcified. It is not a command that we conceive of our modern world along pre-modern lines. The Bible is a historical portrait in which Christ sits and from which Christ emerges. It is both a long shadow cast and a transfiguring light revealing not answers so much as the value in asking questions. And perhaps this is part of the rub too for atheists, that religion doesn't provide answers in the way that science does, or in the way that misguided believers assert that religion does. Christianity at its best and most vibrant understands that conclusions take a back seat to wonder, possibility, and the ceaseless crafting of self, climate, and culture. And when the world, including, for instance, the Christians opposed to LGBTQ rights with their imagined scriptural precedent, and the atheists whose hackles go up over the behavior of those Christians, finally sees that it's not bigots like the late Fred Phelps, or science deniers whose faith hinges on creationism, that are the legitimate faces and voices of actual Christianity, but instead people like poet Christian Wyman, novelist and essayist Marilyn Robinson, activist John Deere, and preacher Frederick Buechner, the better off we'll all be.